Subhash is the Regents Professor of Computer Science Department of Oklahoma State University. Among several of his academic titles that he presently carries, only one I would like to mention is that he has received the honor of Padma Shri, and he is a key member of the Indian Prime Minister's Science, Technology, and Innovation Advisory Council. Subhash visited Twin Cities more often when his sister Rashmi and her husband, Dr. Anil Kaul, lived in Minneapolis. I respect Subhash greatly, not simply for his brilliance, but because it is accompanied by humility. As we say in Sanskrit, Vidya Vinaya Sampanna. He has been a speaker at our Hindu temple several times, most notably when we invited him during the celebration of the 150th birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda. He was also kind enough to speak a couple of years ago at this very forum for Sunday discourses which have been underway since 1979. We are fortunate to have him here today to help us launch this new academic year of 23-24. Subhash has written several books. His recent book is titled The Idea of India, Bharat as a Civilization, which addresses both the geographical area connected now with the Indian state and civilizational area, India, that is to be found all over the world in the adoption of yoga and spiritual wisdom. I request my dear friend Subhash now to share his wisdom on this topic this morning. Please, the book, guys. Go and buy it. It's a beautiful book. Thank you. Welcome, Subhash.
Thank you very much, Shashi ji, for your introduction. And I'm really honored and pleased to have this opportunity once again to speak to this group. And as Shashi said, I have been there many times before. And it's really a pleasure to sort of catch up with everybody. Now, it's a very interesting point, the idea of India, for a variety of reasons. One is that economically, India is changing and surging based on purchasing power parity. India is already the world's third largest economy. And even in nominal dollar terms, it's the fifth largest, and it's supposed to be in the top three in the next 4 or 5 years. And in fact, there are a lot of Western commentators who have said that the 21st century is going to be India's century for a variety of reasons. One of them, of course, is the demographics, where India has certain advantages compared to China, for example. A large part of the Indian population is young, and India's population growth has also leveled off. It's very close to 2.1, the fertility rate, which is the replacement rate. So this is the economic angle. But I think the other angle, which is what I focus on in this book, The Idea of India, is more significant. And what is that other angle? The other angle is, first of all, to the inflection point that the entire world society is at. And that inflection point is due to, first of all, a crisis of science, and also due to the fact that the world has squarely entered the AI age. Now, let me talk very quickly about the crisis of science. The crisis of science is that in spite of all the amazing successes that the science of the past 2-3 centuries has had, now we confront the problem of consciousness. What is consciousness? That is the ultimate frontier of science. And if you look at it from the perspective of, let's say, computer science, the question to ask is, why aren't silicon machines conscious while neural machines are? Because if silicon machines were to become conscious, clearly that will change the world. These silicon machines, these conscious machines, will, in most likelihood, either only enslave humanity, but in more likelihood, they'll simply get rid of us because we are never happy. pesky little creatures. So they just get rid of us. So the world as we know it will cease to exist. In fact, a little personal story, 6-7 years ago, DARPA, which you know is the apex society or institution in the US, which looks at dawning new technology. And DARPA was also responsible about 50 years ago for the creation of the internet. They funded that research. So 6-7 years ago, DARPA, through SRI, and through SRI stands for Stanford Research International, and they didn't want to do it directly for reasons that will become obvious. They funded several meetings, week-long meetings, where just a few 30-40 people were invited from the fields of science, from physics, computer science, neuroscience, and some program managers out of Washington. And the task they were given was, will computers of the future become conscious? Not necessarily 10 years out, maybe 50 years out or 1,000 years out. Will computers become conscious? And the reason why they didn't want their name behind it was because, it sort of overlaps the domain of religion or belief and all that. So they did it through SRI. And we had several meetings, week-long meetings, and I was one of them, some of the world's leading scientists. And the one I can tell you that took place in Cambridge, UK, this is the only one which was outside of the US. We took a poll, the participants. And what's interesting is about 50% said, yes, computers will become conscious. And the other 50% said computers will never be conscious. The 50% who said yes were mostly computer scientists who believe that reality as it is also runs according to some computer program. Maybe we don't know it right now, but the whole universe is mechanical. The other 50% were from a diverse backgrounds, and some of them were quantum theorists, and I'm also partly a quantum theory researcher. And the reason why we thought computers will never become conscious, because quantum mechanics itself, its main interpretation is called the Copenhagen interpretation, according to which reality has two sides to it. One is algorithmic or machine-like, or governed by differential equations, such as the Schrodinger equation. But the other side to reality is consciousness. And you cannot reduce one to the other. You cannot reduce consciousness to machine-like behavior. But and this is something that the pioneers of quantum mechanics arrived at in the 1930s. And in fact, one of the two creators of quantum mechanics was the Austrian physicist who was a Vedantin himself, Erwin Schrödinger. And he's written on it, and he said very clearly, first of all, in his autobiography, which he wrote in the 1970s, he said, well, the central idea of quantum mechanics, which we know is the deepest theory of science, because without quantum mechanics, you cannot explain chemistry. Without chemistry, without quantum mechanics, you can't explain physics. Without physics, you can't explain chemistry. Without chemistry, you can't explain biology. Without biology, you can't explain the brain and its complexity, right? So he said the central idea of quantum mechanics came to him when in the 1920s, there was an impasse and science could not explain why the negatively charged electrons don't fall into the positively charged nucleus, right? The central idea, according to him, came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, Ayam Atma Brahma, that this Atman, which is as minute as you can imagine, it's smaller than the smallest, as the Mundak Upanishads says, or the other Upanishads say, or as the Isha Upanishad says, smaller than the smallest, is equivalent to the entire cosmos. And what it really means is the idea that the fundamental aspect of reality is consciousness. And it's through consciousness that we conceive of or comprehend reality, right? It's in our consciousness. But more significantly, as far as his theory was concerned, reality inheres in it all opposites, right? In reality, we have all kinds of opposites, and even in our felt experience, as young people, the young people who are listening would know that life itself, or not just young people, everybody, life is bringing together things that don't make sense. Falling in love also comes together with, well, do I love or do I love not? Life, living, as a poet has said, in order to live, you have to die every day in many different ways, metaphorically, not physically, right? So Schrödinger held on to it, or abstracted it from the idea that all kinds of opposites should be a characteristic of the micro world. And that is the heart of quantum mechanics. In quantum mechanics, all mutually exclusive properties inhere in the quantum state. But when you interact with it, you are able to access only one of those mutually exclusive properties. And by mutually exclusive, what I mean is, in the classical world, in our normal world, in the world of our senses, for example, when you're wearing a pair of shoes, the shoes could be either black or red or brown or whatsoever other color. But in the micro world, the same pair of shoes would be both red and black and brown, or whatever other color you can think of, which is why in the double slit experiment, the electron, which is massive, which is an object which has a certain physical presence, is able to go through both the holes of both the slits of the screen and merge and interfere with itself, right? There's no other way to explain it. So I don't want to get too much into the physics aspect of it, but the idea of opposites inhering was central to the very creation of quantum mechanics. And of course, it has had huge successes. But after the Second World War, there has been an effort, quite a serious effort in theory circles, that maybe you can explain the observer himself or herself based on quantum mechanics. And all those theories have been unsuccessful. And the dominant view, even now, is that consciousness is outside of materiality. And that is really what the Vedas are all about, what Vedanta is all about, which is that you have consciousness as the ultimate reality, in fact, and out of it emerges everything. Out of consciousness emerges everything. So in fact, Einstein's slogan was space and time. Not Einstein himself, but after relativity theory in 1905, Minkowski came up with his formulation that the best way to look at reality is as space-time. They are together. Reality is four-dimensional. But truly, after the working of the past 110, 15 years, since 1908 of Minkowski, what has emerged is that reality is space, time, and consciousness. Consciousness cannot be reduced to space and time. And I've written many papers on it recently. In fact, I have perhaps one of my very best papers coming out in the next month or two in the Journal of AI and Consciousness. The title is No-Go Theorems on Machine Consciousness. A preprint is somewhere there which you can look at, but the journal article will come very soon. So I have theorems which prove what Vedanta is. If you look at the formal framework of Vedanta, it is in the texts such as the Brahma Sutras, the Upanishads, and the Bhagavad Gita. And the essence of this, which is the essence of Hinduism, really, essence of Sanatana Dharma, is that consciousness cannot be reduced to materiality. Consciousness is another dimension. And my paper, very happy to tell you, is able to, using quantum mechanics, etc., come up with this theorem that consciousness is something more. It's transcendent, and that's what Upanishads such as Mundak and others say. What they say is that there are two aspects to reality. One is accessible to language, and the other is not. What is accessible to language is called apara vidya. Apara meaning which is here, out here, not far. Para is like far. Apara vidya is like our normal existence is apara, and you can, in this, objects are separate. You can look at their associations, properties, and come up with sciences, physical or abstractions. So that is apara vidya. But there is another vidya, which is the vidya of consciousness, which is called para vidya. And in fact, the very heart of the Vedas, the very heart of Sanatan Dharma is this science of para, of the para, and para means transcendent here, which is consciousness. So what Hinduism or what India is really all about, apart from embracing all of the apara sciences, so Hinduism embraces all sciences that they are. In fact, in the Vedas, it's stated that behind the unfolding of the universe is Ritam, and Ritam meaning laws. There are laws, which means Hinduism doesn't believe in what, things happening just like that. There are laws, apara, but beyond that, what holds it together, or what holds our understanding of it, props it up, is the experiencing self, which is the Atman. That Atman interpenetrates all of reality. It doesn't mean that a rock doesn't have Atman. Atman is everywhere, transcendent. It's not in space and time. It's present everywhere. And there is only one Atman. That's the beauty of it. And even Erwin Schrödinger wrote about it. And he said in his book, What is Life, which side story, late 30s or early 40s, somewhere around that. And when he wrote, these were his lectures at Dublin. When he wrote this book, Francis Crick was a theoretical physicist, and he happened to read it. So he switched his field from theoretical physics to biology. And as we know, Crick and Watson discovered the structure of the genetic code. Right? So this idea of consciousness being so central that it interpenetrates. Yeah, the whole idea is that consciousness is present everywhere, and this is something that's very hard for someone whose intuition is object-centered to relate to. That it's in the rock, it's everywhere, it's in our mind, it sort of it illuminates the various layers of the mind. One of the differences between Western thought and Indian thought or Vedic thought is, in Western thought, the mind is kind of a black box, and mind is taken to be equivalent to consciousness, right? In Hindu thought or in Vedic thought, mind is an instrument. Mind is also objective, but its contents are illuminated by the light of consciousness. And in fact, consciousness itself is given the name of Ishvara or Shiva. And so all of us are the same individual. This is kind of revolutionary thought. All of us are the same individual. If we feel we are different, because all of us have the same Atman. If we are different, that's because of our memories are different. The light coming from consciousness within us is covered by coverings of different kind, so that all of this light doesn't reach us. And that's when we do an association of our true self with our mind and not with this light. Because if one were to associate it with that light, then you'd be able to stand up and proclaim Aham Brahmasmi. right? Or Shivoham. I am the cosmos, I am the Brahman. When you say I'm the cosmos, you don't really mean I'm the physical cosmos. What you mean is that you are the light which illuminates this cosmos, which means you are Brahman or you are Shiva. The term Shiva became popular later on, although it's in the Vedas itself as Rudra, for example, and Shivam as auspicious, right? So all of this is the crisis that modern world faces. And one is the crisis of science, crisis of consciousness. And this crisis doesn't only pervade computer science, but it also pervades physics, because physics is able to explain only 0.5% of the cosmos. Why? Because it cannot explain why the universe expansion has accelerated 4 or 5 billion years ago, and therefore it is postulated 68% of dark energy, and it can't explain the speeds at which the various stars and galaxies are moving, and for that it has had to postulate 28% of dark matter. 68 plus 28 is 96%, and 3.5% of physical reality is interstellar dust. So that's 99.5%. It cannot explain any of that. So it can explain only 0.5% of the cosmos, which is a huge, huge crisis. So this is one side where the idea of India is so central, and I'll tell you why these difficulties get resolved. The second is the fact that we are entering the AI age. We are already a part of it, so jobs will disappear more and more all across. Just to give you a small piece of statistic, in the US, it's been estimated that about 60% of all the jobs are to do with transportation. So if tomorrow you had self-driving cars and trucks, imagine the kind of havoc that would be wreaked on the American economy if 60% of the people were rendered jobless. Then a lot of the other jobs are done by humans, but where computers can replace them. In fact, there are some people who are saying that instead of 8 billion people, there would be enough jobs only for about 1 billion or even less in the next 50 or 100 years. Now, of course, we don't know whether this change would be sudden. If they would be sudden, then clearly wars would become even more intense. And the Ukraine war, incidentally, is partly driven by these ideas that we are only machines or bodies, and therefore we must dominate other bodies. In fact, this is an idea, in the intuitions that good people or philosophers and thinkers have had all over the world. In Roman thought, there was this dichotomy between sinister and dexter. Sinister means which takes the body to be, which takes the individual to be only the body. Dexter is where there is a more synthesis. Sinister was also associated with the left hand and dexter with the right hand. But really the deeper meaning was sinister means demonic or body centric. And dexter means that really you can't look at the body by itself. You must look at body and the spirit. Of course, the word consciousness was not used in the Western tradition, but the body and the spirit as a kind of as a pair, right? In fact, in Italian, left parties are called sinistra parties, even now, sinistra. And the right parties are called destra. Now, a big crisis that is happening in America right now, the woke crisis. The woke crisis comes from the understanding that we are nothing but bodies. And if you're nothing but bodies, then we must see how we can be one body or the other. That maybe I'm not one gender, I'm another gender, or I'm 52 other genders, right? So these kinds of confusions are emerging from a left-centered or body-centric view of the world. And in fact, you can explain a lot of what is going on in the world, because, you know, I forgot to tell you that in Washington and in many other parts of the world, the computer paradigm has become so dominant or so powerful or so pervasive that people really believe that this is what we are. We are also a machine. But in reality, there's a mystery. And that mystery is what the Atma Vidya of the Vedas addresses, what the Vedas say that they are Atma Vidya. You can even understand the attacks on Sanatan Dharma recently. As you know, this has been a big story in India. A few weeks ago, there was a conference in Chennai saying that how can Sanatan Dharma be eradicated? Or this was a conference for the eradication of Sanatan Dharma. And there are many other politicians who have jumped on the fray. And what they do, you know, disingenuously, is to say that Sanatan Dharma is caste. Sanatan Dharma has nothing to do with caste. Sanatan Dharma, which Aldous Huxley, because he claimed to be a part of Sanatan Dharma himself. You know, some people have said his Brave New World was the greatest book of the 19th century, or the 20th century. So Sanatan Dharma, Aldous Huxley gave it the name the perennial philosophy. He thought the word dharma would become maybe too complicated for people who are outside of that tradition. Perennial philosophy. What Sanatan Dharma, what the heart of Sanatan Dharma is this idea that there is the same single Atman within every living being. There is no distinction there. And it's this in embodiments. There are the whole idea of Purusha Sukta, for example, that there were 4 different classes associated with it. But because of recursion, these 4 classes are present in each individual. So it has nothing to do with jati, etc. Jati is familial lineage. But in any event, during the British rule of India, and I do discuss all of this with the appropriate citations, about 1900 or so, the census, what happened was that the British insisted that they were going to plug every jati into a certain varna, where these jatis said, we don't know what varna we are. So the jati system that we know, the caste system as we know, was created by the British. And also, we should not forget that until about 1000, because of India's population and India's, you know, fecundity in terms of land and everything else, and the crafts and the arts and so on, India's share of the world economy, it's been estimated, was about 45%, about 1000. After 1000 to 1800, you know, there were lots of invasions, there was war, etc. It's been estimated, and these are, you know, well-known Western scholars, that India's share of the world economy was 20 to 25% when the British came. When the British, 1800, they were dominant. 1817, I think they defeated the Marathas, and then they had total control over India. So the India's share of the world economy was, say, 20 to 25%. By the First World War, India's share has been estimated to have come down to 1.8%. The 19th century was a century of devastation and famines. The British didn't go around beheading people as used to happen prior. What the British did was, firstly, through tariffs, and then as in the 1820s, the Industrial Revolution took off, they made sure that India became a dumping ground for their products, and India was not allowed to build any factories at all. So India became impoverished, and it's been estimated that about 50 to 100 million Indians died in famines. That's when these jatis, you know, who had been prosperous in the past, they turned on each other. I'm not disputing that there may not have been jati oppression, but what the British did and what subsequent to that has become the narrative on India has been about this oppression is totally false. Because when you read the accounts of India, let's say by Abdul Razak, who went to the Vijayanagar Empire, when he exclaimed that nowhere in the world was a city as wonderful and as rich with all communities as in Vijayanagar Empire, that when he came. Or when you read the Chinese ambassadors, when you read the Greek ambassadors to India, Chinese ambassadors or travelers, religious travelers during the Gupta Empire or Harshavardhan Empire, India was extremely prosperous, and that's what they economists estimate, 45% of the world economy, and then down to 1.8%. After the First World War, the British did allow some factories to come together, the steel mills of the Tatas and so on. So by the time they left in 1947, it was about 3%. So what the constant din that we hear in the British, in the Indian magazines and Indian academia, which still looks at India through the Western eye. It's very shocking that most of the Indian academics who work on Indians' history don't know the original languages. They're only using second or third hand accounts. They don't know either Sanskrit or Pali or whatever else, or Rajasthani or Braj Bhasha or whatever. They're only regurgitating the British view, which was a product of the horrific things that happened in India. In fact, one of the famous book on it, Late Victorian Holocaust, by this author, I forget, a famous author. He just passed away last month, I believe. If you just Google Late Victorian Holocaust, it summarizes, the famines that took place in India. In fact, even in the 1940s, the famine that was caused by Winston Churchill in Bengal led to 3 million deaths, because he sent the food that had been produced, agriculture that had been produced in Bengal, and it was enough. He sent it to for the British Army, not that they needed it, but they thought that there should be sufficient reserves, and that led to the horrific Bengal famine of the 1940s. So in other words, India's had a interesting backstory, history, extremely rich, not only in the sciences, and in spite of all that, the sciences that we know right now, which have done all that amazing stuff. I already mentioned quantum mechanics and its Vedic antecedents, if you will. But the other side to modern science is, of course, computer science and computer hardware. Computer science, one is programming, the other is hardware. In hardware, you have logic and logic gates. In programming, what you have is a language and rules about rules, which is called meta language. That's how a computer language is written, program is written. Now, all scholars around the world accept that 500 BCE, Panini's grammar, Ashtadhyayi, which is 4,000 rules and rules about rules, which describe the entire Sanskrit language, is the most amazing computer program, that has ever been written. So that's one side. And Ashtadhyayi was to influence all of social sciences in the 19th century. Fred de Saussure, the French sociologist, it created linguistics as we know. It was taken from Ashtadhyayi, and that from there came sociology, because the idea came that if you could describe a language through rules, maybe you could also describe relationships in a society through rules. That's how sociology and anthropology were born. So a lot of the sciences go back to Indian view of it. You also have Bharat Muni, his Natya Shastra. He also came up with a science of gesture, drama and so on. But the other side is computer hardware. Now, computer hardware and its language, computer mathematical logic, is ascribed or credited to 3 British scientists or mathematicians of mid-19th century, and their names are Charles Babbage, Augustus de Morgan, and George Boole. You still have De Morgan's laws in mathematics or Boolean mathematics. Now, so they did it in 1850s, and they got credit for it. But in 1890s, 1897, George Boole's widow, who was a very prominent science writer in England, she wrote a famous essay, and she said, it's good that my husband and his compatriots get all the fame, but the world has forgotten that these three learned what they had, or what they had to say, from George Everest, who was the Surveyor General of India, and after whom Mount Everest is named, which in Nepali language is, of course, called Sagarmatha. But to honor him, it's called Mount Everest in English. So George Everest was a great lover of Indian knowledge, and he would visit Britain from time to time, and he had a salon, and these three were a part of his salon. And George Everest came to Britain and he said, look, I have learned this logic in India, which of course now we know is called Navya Nyaya, which developed in Bihar and Bengal about 800 CE onwards. And now scholars acknowledge that Navya Nyaya is exactly equivalent to mathematical logic. Exactly. There's nothing in mathematical logic which is beyond what Navya Nyaya tells you. So even there, in the days of India's misery in the 19th century, India kept on, inspiring the West. And now what I say, that this will continue to happen because the central problem of modern times is the problem of consciousness, and that is the very heart of Atma Vidya, that is the very heart of the Vedas, and that is what is missing in modern science, because modern science cannot explain, as I said, 99.5% of the physical universe. It can't explain consciousness, it can't explain psychology, medicine is also a problem. And now let me, in the next few minutes, give a personal angle where I'll connect up this Vedic sciences to where we stand in the world at this point. Now, just to as background, we do know that allopathy, and Shashi is a doctor, so he would agree with me. Allopathy means treating symptoms. Allopathy is based on binary logic, right? You either have symptoms or you don't have. Now, Ayurveda is based on ternary logic, which is three. You have three doshas, right? Or you have three gunas. Now, with having said this, now we also know that the effectiveness in treating COVID in the Western world was pretty bad, abysmal, compared to where people were using their logic or whatever, even India or Japan or Southeast Asia or in Nigeria, the fatality rate, if you trust their statistics, was 15 to a million. In the US, the fatality rate was 4,000 to a million. But of course, the US fatality rate was probably padded because the hospitals were getting extra money. If they said that a patient who died, even if he was 90, if he died with COVID, it was assigned to because of COVID. So those statistics, I don't want to get into, but I want to give you an interesting personal story which will connect all of this. About 6-7 years ago, I worked on AI, as you know, one of the first people to work on neural networks in the 90s. In fact, I discovered a instantaneously trained neural network logic, which can explain how short-term memory works. So I worked on that. I worked on quantum mechanics. Okay. So in the 2017 or so, 2016, 2017, I got an email from Austria. They said, we are organizing this conference on multiple valued logic, which is a major conference which is held every year, and it's done by people who work in the field of logic, which is a part of general electrical engineering. They said, can you give a keynote speech on your work on neural networks? So I said, good. I hadn't visited Austria very well. I had been there before. So I said, this will be another opportunity. So I said, I should also look up what mathematical logic, what are these people who work on mathematical logic do? And I discovered that in logic, there is a theorem that binary logic is not optimal. Ternary logic is optimal. Logic in threes. And in the 1970s, there were even attempts in Russia and elsewhere to build computers based on ternary logic, because they would have been more efficient than binary logic. But ultimately, they were abandoned because the hardware for binary logic was too entrenched. Okay. So this is nice. I didn't know this, because reading only physicists themselves have been driven by binary logic. And in fact, there are leading physicists, including the guy who was the supervisor to Richard Feynman, saying that, you know, the whole universe is to be seen in zeros and ones. No, just because computer scientists do zeros and ones, but zeros and ones are not optimal. Physicists don't know it, and very few computer scientists know it. So then I said, well, I should investigate this even further. It so turns out that if you admit real numbers, then even ternary is not optimal. What is optimal is the number E, which is 2.718. Okay. All right. Now, fast forward some. So I learned all this. I gave my speech. We went to Vienna, my wife and I, we went to Vienna and other cities. And here I'm in 2020. I'm here in this house in Miami, 2020. COVID has broken out. Now, of course, fortunately in Miami, we could do everything. You know, we didn't have to wear masks, although I believe in Minnesota, people were driving in their cars with masks on inside, even if they were alone. Fortunately, it wasn't as bad as here, but we are still tossing and turning. And suddenly I had this brainwave. The brainwave was, what? Since all of reality is optimal, isn't it possible that, and if E is optimal and 3 is not, is it possible that the universe itself is E-dimensional, that space is E-dimensional and not 3-dimensional? Okay, so this thought came to me, and then I quickly wrote up a paper. I looked up this stuff, and I discovered that there was a major crisis in cosmology related to the speed at which the universe was expanding. And if you took it to be E-dimensional, that crisis goes away. So I sent a paper very quickly. It just took me a few days to write it, sent it to Nature, and they said, yeah, we'll publish it in Nature Scientific Reports. It came in November of 2020. After that, I've written a whole series of papers. They're still under the radar, so to speak, because it's so far out that reality is not 3-dimensional, it's E-dimensional. So if you do this, then you are able to explain also dark matter, dark energy. You don't need dark matter and dark energy. You are able to explain why the universe started, the acceleration began 5 billion years ago, and it will then slow down and all of that stuff. And it will be, order will be restored. The universe will not die a cold freeze. It will come back, which is, of course, the old view that we have in India, that the universe, creates. Firstly, it manifests itself, consciousness into Akash, Akash into Vayu, into Tejas, into Apa, into Prithvi, which are 4 modes of reality. And then you have evolution. The Vedas, the Indian system accepts evolution. It accepts everything. You have billions of years. The age of this cycle is totally in conformity, as even Carl Sagan admitted in his famous program, that it's 13, 15 billion years, quite consistent with modern estimates. So there is evolution, but all this evolution is guided by consciousness. Now, because I do want to leave some time for questions and answers, let me just close with 2 small points. The question that might be asked, if there is consciousness which is transcendent, how does consciousness interact with the physical universe? 2 answers to it. One is consciousness interpenetrates all physical universe. Now, my late friend, very famous physicist of our modern times, George Sudarshan, who was from Kerala. In the 1970s, he wrote a paper where he explained how the observer or consciousness, just by observation, can control the evolution of a physical system. And he called it the quantum Zeno effect. And it's been demonstrated in the labs that indeed that is true. And this is a part of the Vedic tradition. And this question was asked in the Vedic system, in Vedanta itself. The question was asked, why do you need divinity? Why do you need Vishnu or Shiva? Because they are names for consciousness, right? Why do you need them? Because everything is according to rhythm, right? And the answer was given, and it's called Drishti Srishti Vada. That through drishti, through observation, the deity is able to do creation. And I've even written mathematical papers on it, showing how you can, by changing probabilities, the conscious agent can change the evolution of the physical system. He doesn't have to manifest himself or herself physically to change a system, right? So to conclude, it all hangs together. It's truly beautiful. My own personal journey has been full of, excitement and fulfillment, because everything hangs together. Creativity comes through consciousness. And we know from the example, my own, I can give personal examples. Let's speak about Srinivas Ramanujan, the great mathematician who died at the age of 32, 33. He was self-taught. His notebooks are still being analyzed. And he would say that the goddess Namagiri would dictate the formulas, because there was no background to these formulas, to him. And then he would write them down, because he couldn't explain where these formulas came from. Even in the West, some of the greatest things that have happened, for example, the Industrial Revolution beginning was done by this this American guy, I forget his first name, Howe. And at that time, in the 1700s, there were these attempts to invent sewing machine, because women at that time had to spend the entire day darning clothes or knitting or sewing, right? And people were trying to invent a machine, and they couldn't do it. And then he had this trance, and in that he saw these Indians with these spears, and the tip of the spear was open. There was an eye. And he woke up and he realized that this is what he needed. He needed a needle with an eye, and that, the eye to pull the thread up. And that is the very heart of the sewing machine. Almost all inventions, and I know some of the world's leading scientists and thinkers or artists, when you talk to them, they say, yeah, it was not my conscious thought. I was either sleeping, or I was dreaming, or suddenly it came spontaneously. There was an epiphany. I can't explain where it came from. That is what the Vedas say is the gods speaking through you, Shiva speaking through you, or Krishna speaking through you. So it all hangs together. All of the Indian tradition hangs together. The only problem is that a lot of Indians, because they've been separated from this tradition, especially in the last 70 years, whatever we have been told about the Vedic tradition is through the Western gaze, which doesn't quite get it. Even Western scholars don't get it. Not because they're not trying to be honest, but because they're still their intuition is through the object view. And when you are looking at it through the object perspective, you miss it. You miss the fact, they say, well, where does the God sit? Or the God came to you. No, consciousness interpenetrates all of reality. So with this, let me stop. And so all of these themes and how these themes change the world that we know across the Himalayas, across the seas as well, across the Himalayas, the idea of consciousness as being primary went to China and Japan. And even though they speak of Buddhism, but really the way they conceive of Buddhism does include all of this. And it went to the West as well. The Slavic world, the Slavs became Christian only 1,000 years ago. The chief deity of the Slavs 1,000 years ago was called Svetovid, which is really a Sanskrit word Shvetovid or Shvantovid, and it had 4 faces. The idea of 4 simultaneous faces of God, of consciousness, is that because consciousness is present everywhere, in all directions. Shiva has 4 faces or 5 faces, right? Because Shiva is in all, or Krishna or Vishnu has 1,000 faces, which means all of reality. Or Krishna dances with everybody because it's the same Atman. You know, people then say, hey, Krishna married so many people. These are people who don't get it. It means something else. It means that the spirit, the same spirit is everywhere. So I am convinced all of this is going to transform the world. All of the world, this yoga, the true meaning of yoga will be embraced by people everywhere, and this will transform the world. Wonderful. Thank you very much to all of you to have given me this opportunity.
Subhash,
Yes.
enjoyed greatly. You know what? I think that is how our old sages were clairaudient and clairvoyant, were able to see and hear when they were in deep concentrated faith, and deep sleep, of course, is a perfect position for that. I think only thing I see is, first of all, a wonderful job trying to summarize such a tough topic in a short time. Your mission, should you decide to accept it, mission impossible. You're not done, man. You got to come back again, because you got to amplify these thoughts over the next few months, not every day, but on frequent basis. Number 2, I think the way I look at it, I think we, coming from the Indian heritage, have to take pride, but never develop arrogance. Number 2 is to go back to our old languages, dip into it, start learning, and that's what we do in our temple school here. We teach regional languages, including Sanskrit, and that will allow the next generation to go back into what already has been done by old sages, and start with that as a base foundation, and build on it with your intuition and continued studies. So that's the way I look at it. Thank you very much.
Totally agree. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I ask a question, Kashyap here? Subhash, nice talk. And as you know, there is a big problem. Which came first, consciousness or matter? Science would say matter came first, because, you know, it's the Big Bang and then matter. And then stars and planets and came first, and then the conscious people came. On Earth, it took billions of years. I mean, like 10 billion years after Big Bang before human beings came. So what is your opinion?
Yeah, it's very clear. You know, you're absolutely right. The psychology view is that consciousness is emergent. You know, the complexity of the neural connections, once it hits a certain value, the system becomes conscious, right? So that is the whole thing. And in fact, this is precisely what we are discussing in our DARPA or SRI conference as well. And there are those who believe that complexity leads to consciousness. But my new paper with theorems shows that it's impossible, that consciousness is transcendent. It's existent by itself. And I can explain the intuition of that theorem in a minute. Let's say you have a system which is sufficiently complex and it's become conscious, right? You can imagine a mechanical or electrical or whatever system. Now, this system itself could be a subpart of a larger system. Then you'll have the problem that a conscious object would have another conscious object within it, which is impossible. Consciousness is one, as Schrodinger also says. And even logically, you can say that if consciousness emerges out of complexity, then the seed of consciousness was present. All the laws were present even at Big Bang. So consciousness was present as a seed even at Big Bang. Even if you were to ignore what my theorem, which is going to be published, is going to say. So the Indian view, the Vedic view is consciousness is primary. And even now here, when you shut your eyes, you don't see the outer world. It's through your consciousness that you conceive of reality. And in fact, in the Upanishads, you have dialogues such as, through which power do you see? You don't see through the power of your eyes, because eyes are an instrument. You see through the power of the Atman. Atman is consciousness. Hearing through the power of the Atman, right? Moving through the power of the Atman, because otherwise you will just be a part of a pravaha, of a flow. You won't be able to even act beyond that flow. So everything that happens is through the power of the Atman. And that Atman is transcendent. It is present in this reality, but it also transcends this reality.
I don't want to take too much time, but maybe quick question. Why did evolution take such a long time then?
Evolution takes time because for it to project itself, it needs a complexity. It's like you might ask, why did a television receiver take so much of time? Television receiver doesn't have life, right? It doesn't have consciousness, but it is the sufficient complexity for it to receive the electromagnetic waves and convert them into images. You see that? So likewise, the brain, the structure, monkey also has consciousness, but its consciousness, it can't do, say, calculus, right? While we can, at least some of us can, right? So it needs sufficient time for that complexity to emerge, for that consciousness to illuminate the contents effectively.
Thank you.
Well, I have a thought to offer that I see as complementary to what you said, Subhash. And that is that in modern Western thinking, I think it's not correct to categorize it as being either material first or consciousness first. There are many modern thinkers in neuroscience and in philosophy who acknowledge that out of Western tradition, we do not have an answer. And that relationship is most famously known as the hard problems, a phrase coined by David Chalmers, right, and adopted by a great many people. There are philosophers like Nagel, for example, most famous paper about what it's like to be a bat. But his more recent book is devoted to the exploration of the idea that traditional evolutionary thinking does not account for consciousness, and therefore we have to revise our traditional thinking. So within Western thought, there's a great deal happening that certainly draws on Indian tradition, but it is also indigenous to the Western process. They're not somehow either mutually exclusive or competitive.
True. I totally agree. And I am familiar with all this people that you mentioned. But what's also interesting is that one can either talk from a distance and speak, in overarching way as we've been doing, but from the perspective of participating. As far as you're participating in this universe, you're always dancing between two sides to reality, consciousness and physicality. They are both sides. You can't negate one or the other. And that is true within one's own, inner felt experience, or how we react with or interact with others. Now, it's also true that in retrospect, you can always explain away everything as being physical alone, because consciousness is not a thing. So when you can always say that we are all zombies. Later on, 100 years from now, we can say that everybody was a zombie, and you can't contradict that. You can't contradict, because we are physical, because whatever we do is theoretically explainable by physical laws, because consciousness is kind of a hidden. It comes in a mysterious way. It comes in a mysterious way only as far as the subjective experience is concerned. But objectively, we are governed by physical laws. And therefore, there would always be, when we are describing our personal experience, there will always be this dichotomy, this duality to it. You could either speak of one or the other. But anyway, I totally agree with you what you say, because I also would like to emphasize, and here I pick up on what Shashi said. All humans, all consciousness is one. All humans are the same. So this division into East and West, because East and West have interacted in so many ways at so many times in the past. These are just convention that we say East or West. We are really one. We are the same.
Exactly.
I have one question.
Sure.
We say there were Vimanas, and then there is some Vedic book which explains how to make or have what are the principles behind it.
Okay.
Even
okay,
the ISRO chief said something about it.
I can answer that. Okay. Vimanas.
So what is the book? What is the book?
Okay, Vimana Shastra of Brihaspati, right?
Yeah, and can we make
okay,
something?
no. I'll address this question. Okay, now what is very interesting in India is that, because in the Mahabharata or even Ramayana, there is this mention of in Ramayana Viman or Pushpak Viman. From Lanka, Ram and Sita, and they come in a plane. It's called Pushpak Viman. Viman is a plane, okay? And then in the Mahabharata, there are very interesting things mentioned. For example, 100 kids born from the same embryo, or there is weapons which can destroy everything, etc., etc. So there are some people in India who say, well, all of this technology existed. And this claim of people to say that this existed is used by opponents of India to say that, look, Indians are crazy. They're making all these claims, right? So this is a convenient stick to beat Indians with. So what is the reality? As far as Vimana, first of all, these Vimans, etc., the best way to look at it is to look at the way imagination works. You have the imaginations of science fiction writers. Imagination, consciousness is an amazing thing. So we can look at some of those things from the perspective of imagination, say 2,000 years ago. They conceived of, well, why can't we fly in a machine? In fact, in Mahabharata, there is also a very interesting episode where there is an attack by people in spaceships, by people who are wearing airtight suits. If you go to Mahabharata, you'll see it. I think it's in Saubh Parva. Okay, but the best way to look at it is to see this as the imaginations of the poet. Now, what about Viman Shastra? Viman Shastra became famous in 1890s because about the time that the Wright brothers were doing their flying experiments, there was this book that came up suddenly, and it said that you can actually build a flying ship. But scholars have investigated that and concluded it was made up in the 1890s. It's really not an ancient book. So that can be dismissed. So all the stuff that we have, how we can use lead and this or that to create a flying saucer, flying a ship, that doesn't. So that's not credible at all. So there is no problem. So to come back, to give you a summary, and I do provide a summary in the book also, The Idea of India, everything hangs together. It's all systematic. It's all reasonable. And the beauty of Ayurveda, for example, is it's ternary logic, but it also has a place for the mind. And now in modern medicine, you have a problem that 35% of the people are cured by placebos, right? Because allopathy doesn't have a proper place for mind and body to interact with each other. So you put it in a side room. You've said, okay, this is placebo, or this is nocebo, or this or that. So in my view, the time has come to look at all of this tradition as world tradition. This is the inheritance of all of mankind, humankind. And the reason why it flowered in India was because the Indian sages, they looked at reality in the most direct way. They asked these questions most directly. seek and you shall be answered. They sought these questions, and they're amazing stuff. In physics, 7 years ago, I translated Vaisheshik Sutras. Amazing stuff there. Amazing stuff about how there are 4 kinds of elementary anus, which do correspond to 4 elementary particles that we have. Anus, and of course, that's being done as an abstraction, and how mind and the physical system interacts and so on. So there's incredible stuff. The time has come for people in India and elsewhere. In India, partly to be more logically connected, more in a more sensible way to connect it to one's past, and for the West, but certainly the past is past. It doesn't really matter. What matters is now and the future, and that's where all the discussions of consciousness are going to be center stage, and that's going to be, that is the frontier of science, frontier of philosophy, frontier of physics, frontier of computer science, frontier of neuroscience.
Thank you.
I have one question. It's a very mundane one. I go to schools and talk to students, high school students at 9th grade to 12th grade. So how much can we conceivably explain this to students like that, or better not to even get into that?
No,
Is
you
there a
can.
level?
No, it's best to level. What is the difference between the so-called Western view and the so-called Indian view? Indian view accepts all the laws, etc., that you have about nature. It's not belief in magic, but it says there is something additional, which is consciousness. That's it. In the Western view, consciousness is a product of space and time and matter. In the Indian view, you have space, time, and matter plus consciousness, and this consciousness works through the matter, through the complexity of the brain. Of course, if there's no brain, then there won't be any felt experience, right? So in some sense, we are very central to it. We are very central to it, and the sages accepted it, and that's why the sages, even the temple architecture was Purush. They either in the elevation, the top, the shikhar is the head, right? Or in the plan, you had the 5 chakras at various places. If you look at the great temples from South India, and in the Chidambaram temple, for example, there's also a 1,000-pillared hall. That 1,000-pillared hall represents the Sahasrara chakra. And you have the other 5 chakra, the Agya chakra, the Vishuddha chakra, etc., etc. So there are those places, and the feet of the Purush is the Gopuram. So the entire temple was in the image of the Purush. And you have this, even in music, you have the idea of Sangeet Purush. So the idea that this Purush manifests in all creativity is a very powerful idea. Now, of course, as a young person, if you talk to a 9th grader, they would just put it aside and they'll say, we are the body. And I think that is perfectly reasonable. You don't focus on the Atman when you are a young person. Your Bahir Pragya, your consciousness is focused outwards. And that is the way it should be. And you learn through navigating through the outer world. Right? But there's a certain time when you're ready, and that's when you learn how to swim within the cosmos which is within.
Thank you. That gives me some ideas.
But it's truly, I can't tell you, I get excited. It's so truly beautiful, I can't tell you. Everything which we have misunderstood all these decades, we have misunderstood these things, and we have kicked this away. We have said this is nonsense. Or right now, of course, there's also strange stuff like, now I come from Kashmir. In India, you had all kind of in social life, there were all kinds of backgrounds. Some people ate meat, some people didn't eat meat, but now, which is very strange. People are saying that if you are a vegetarian, that is acting like vegetarian privilege. you are looking down on others. That's ridiculous. You know, some people didn't eat meat because there was a certain rat or vratam. You said, I'm going to be guided by this discipline in my life. And that's perfectly fine. Some people may decide not to eat, you know, shrimp or whatever else. I come from Kashmir. Everybody ate meat there when we were growing up. But at some point, 30 years ago, I said, well, I don't think I'm going to eat meat. So I became a vegetarian. In fact, the story is more interesting. My wife is from the Himalayas, and she came from a family which was vegetarian, and I was non-vegetarian. So in the beginning, she became non-vegetarian. But as you know, women always win out. So,
right.
Right. So after some time, I became vegetarian, and she's also became vegetarian. So these are interesting little life stories, but they don't address the Atma Vidya. Atma Vidya is transcendent, it's beautiful, it's universal, and it's the only thing that makes sense. And I'm hoping that my recent scientific papers, if you just Google our E-dimensional universe, you'll get a lot of papers which are publicly available, published in cosmology. You can go to Nature, you go, and hopefully they will make an influence, because they've been published only in the last few months, the cosmology papers, and they solve the problem of dark matter and dark energy. And they also explain the fact that there are 25 cognitive centers, tattvas of Sankhya. And this paper also appeared just this spring. So everything hangs together, which is beautiful.
Just out of curiosity, Subhash, what I tell you, I knew Josh Sudarshan very well. He would come to Minneapolis quite often.
Yeah.
And, you know, so it was a lot of interaction. I know his children, who have trained, some of them taught them too.
He was a Vedantin.
Right.
I met him many, many times at the Ohio Vedanta conferences, which sadly have stopped now. Yeah.
Right. So it's going to be
he was a Vedantin. I was very unhappy to discover, you know, or learn of his passing a few years ago. I think 2019 or 2020.
Yeah, right. A little earlier than that.
May I just tell a little story, personal story?
Absolutely.
Okay. I think it was October of 92 or November of 92. I was reading the New Yorker magazine. At the end of it, there used to be a one-page essay. This was by John Updike. And this essay began by saying that, isn't it amazing that the size of the sun and the moon from the earth is about the same, identical? Of course, everybody knows it, but nobody pays any attention, right?
Sure.
We don't pay attention to things which are out there, right? And the moment I read it, and I'm talking about epiphany, I'm talking about where creativity occurs, I knew it had something to do with the very organization of the Rig Veda. And I rushed to my library, I looked at the organization of the Rig Veda, and I discovered that the number of hymns, 1017, which is 339 times 3, and if the sun is 108 times its diameter away from the earth, the moon is 108 times its diameter away from the earth, which is why their size is the same. And most amazingly, the diameter of the sun is 108 times the diameter of the earth. Most amazing. Right. Which is why in the Japamala, in the rosary, Japamala, you have 108 beads, because you're making a symbolic journey from earth, which is your body, to the inner sun, which is your Ishta Devata, right? And in the Bharatanatyam dance, you have 108 karanas, you have 108 dance poses. All of this in Ayurveda, there are 107 marmas, because if you have 108 things together, you have 107 meeting points. It all hangs together. It is beautiful. It is beautiful. With this beauty, let me conclude. Thank you very much for having given me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Namaskar to everybody.
Thank you. Namaste.
Namaskar.